Although they are almost 14,000 kilometers apart, Australia and Canada have a lot in common. This may not come as a surprise. We'll see in today's video how similar these economies are, despite their great distances from one another. Pay attention to the very end. This one is really fascinating. Both Australia and Canada have constitutional monarchies and federal states as their forms of government, and they are both Commonwealth of Nations members with a shared history of British colonization. The particular difficulty faced by both countries is managing relatively tiny populations dispersed over large and hostile regions. Their respective geographic locations are especially noteworthy since, while most of Australia's population is concentrated along the coast, almost 80% of Canada's population resides within 100 miles of the U.S. border. Australia and Canada's economies combined would rank 6th in the world, slightly smaller than Japan's and larger than India's. Considering what you can buy with that money, their GDPs per capita are comparable. Canada has $58,000 and Australia has about $63,000. Both nations' economies are quite similar in that they focus mostly on primary output industries like mining, manufacturing, and agriculture. But compared to Canada, Australia depends more on mining and less on manufacturing. You can observe that they have comparable growth patterns if you examine how their stock markets have expanded over the previous 30 years. This is hardly surprising given that the economies of both nations are heavily reliant on the export of their abundant natural resources around the world. The Queensland town of Charters Towers became so prosperous during the late 1800s gold rush that it established its stock exchange. Now, more than a century later, Queensland is experiencing the conclusion of yet another mining boom. The mining business has its ups and downs, but Australia has persevered through it all. At its height, mining investment represented 9% of the nation's GDP. This was particularly the case when Australia was racing to supply China with coal and iron ore, which resulted in a massive increase in earnings. However, mining corporations ceased funding large projects when the demand and prices for these commodities declined, which resulted in lower spending and fewer jobs. In Canada, similar surges have happened. The first major oil boom in North America occurred in Canada in the 1850s. The majority of the last 30 years have seen growth in crude oil production quantities and export values, which have been fueled by growing investments in oil and gas. Oil sands projects in Canada became the focus of investment in oil and gas projects as technology developed and oil prices increased over time. Since 2008, however, declining oil prices have put a brake on economic growth, slowing it down from Western Canada to the central provinces and causing the industrial and services sectors to decrease. Their corporate environments are also very similar. For instance, the largest infrastructure investment manager in the world is an Australian firm called Macquarie, closely followed by a Canadian corporation called Brookfield. Nevertheless, Fortune's list of the top 10 largest corporations worldwide by revenue shows that 6 of them are American or Chinese. However, the biggest Australian company, BHP Group, a mining corporation, is ranked just 180th, and the top Canadian company, Brookfield Asset Management, is only placed 117th. This demonstrates that Australian and Canadian businesses have forgotten how to compete. Furthermore, the largest economy in the world appears to be a prime example of ideal competition. Coles and Woolworths, Australia's 2 biggest supermarket chains, hold 59% of the country's grocery market. In Canada, the combined sales of Loblaws and Sobeys account for 34% of all groceries, surpassing the combined sales of the top 4 grocery retailers in the United States. In Australia and Canada, the 4 largest banks retain 3/4 of all customer deposits. In the United States, the top banks possess less than half of this amount. It goes beyond grocery and banks, too. Domestic aviation is a duopoly in both nations, whereas telecommunications is a triopoly. The list is endless. A tiny economy may find it difficult to support more than a few participants in a variety of industries if businesses must achieve a particular scale to be economically viable, for example, to afford significant investments in computer systems. Notably, national champions from Australia and Canada are far more lucrative than their American equivalents, especially in the grocery and banking sectors. Appropriately, Australia has given rise to several leading surf clothing firms, while Canada has carved out a market for parkas and other winter apparel. Of course, both are home to massive producers of commodities. With enormous deposits found in Alberta's tar sands, Canada is home to the fourth largest proven oil reserves in the world. Iron ore, coal, and natural gas are among Canada's top commodities exported, in addition to crude oil. Australia is the world's leading producer of lithium, the third largest producer of cobalt, the fourth largest producer of rare earth elements, and the dominant producer of coal and iron ore. It wants to establish itself as a globally significant producer of processed essential minerals by the year 2030. There is, however, another side to this tale. Due to their heavy reliance on exporting their goods to more developed economies, Australia and Canada are also having difficulties. Australia, for example, has strong ties to China. Given that China's economy is the second largest in the world, Australia depends heavily on trade with China. Iron ore, coal, and natural gas are among the main exports from Australia to China, which uses them to power its massive manufacturing and energy needs. Australia's export revenues in 2023 were largely derived from these items, demonstrating just how dependent Australia is on China's economy. Similarly, Canada's economy is closely linked to that of the United States. It's significant because trade between the two countries is essential to Canada's economic growth, and the United States is the country's top trading partner. The U.S. market is the destination of a sizable amount of Canada's exports, which also include energy, natural resources, and automobiles. This trade relationship highlights how dependent Canada's economy is on U.S. demand, which has an immediate effect on jobs, manufacturing, and GDP growth. Furthermore, the United States is a significant source of direct investment in Canada, supporting a range of industries from manufacturing to technology, strengthening the link between American policies and the country's economy. What's occurring is likely a reflection of the resource curse, a condition that has led to issues like political instability and slower economic growth in nations with abundant and rich natural resources in South America and Africa. However, Australia and Canada seem less interested in creating sectors that may compete globally due to their reliance on resources. That could be the reason why there aren't many large Canadian and Australian enterprises that are well known worldwide outside of commodities and outdoor apparel. When it comes to cutting-edge technology, their Incas are especially deficient. Products classified as high-tech by the World Bank include computers, electrical machinery, scientific instruments, medicines, and aerospace. These products account for over 7% of all OECD member exports, but just 4% and less than 2% of exports from Canada and Australia, respectively. The World Intellectual Property indicators show that, in contrast to America's 9.9 and South Korea's 28.2, Canada and Australia only grant 5.9 and 6.7 patents per 10,000 persons, respectively. This is not to say that Canadians and Australians are not talented. Their positions in the World Talent Ranking, where Australia is ranked 18th and Canada is ranked 13th, indicate that they are, in fact, highly skilled. They also boast some of the highest post-secondary education rates in the OECD, along with world-class universities. The main problem is that their innovation systems aren't receiving enough assistance. Compared to the OECD average of 2.7%, research and development expenditures in both Canada and Australia are relatively modest, at 1.7% and 1.8% of GDP, respectively. Furthermore, the combined amount invested in venture capital in Australia and Canada in 2023 was just $8 billion, which is roughly half of what it was the year before. Venture capital helps finance startup companies with significant growth potential. Furthermore, these nations are not very welcoming to foreign investment, with stringent regulations, ownership restrictions, and other barriers making it difficult for foreigners to launch firms there. Nonetheless, Canada and Australia are major immigration hubs. Canada stands out among the nations with high immigration rates. Australia has kept 160,000 yearly immigration as its goal. A key factor in their economy's long-term prosperity is immigration. Both nations will grow older without it. Additionally, immigrants contribute to the expansion of the labor market and the filling of crucial skill gaps in a variety of industries, including technology, healthcare, and engineering. They also provide diversity, innovation, and a wide range of abilities. In terms of the economy, immigration boosts consumer demand for goods and services in addition to augmenting the labor force. Additionally, immigration has a big impact on the housing markets in Australia and Canada, which raises demand and drives up real estate costs in key cities. Being two of the most sought-after locations for immigration, both nations have experienced significant population growth as a result of immigration, which has increased demand for housing. Since most immigrants settle in cities like Sydney and Melbourne in Australia and Toronto and Vancouver in Canada, real estate prices are rising as a result of this demand. Australia and Canada are not alone, though. In the wealthy world, housing costs are high in comparison to salaries. The stark differences between real disposable income and the growth in housing prices in the two nations are depicted in this graphic. In Canada today, the average home is valued at around $650,000, which is greater than 9 times the average household income. This discrepancy isn't exclusive to Canada. In other regions of the world, house prices have diverged significantly from disposable income, giving the United States an extremely low price appearance. Despite their many similarities, Australia appears to be performing better than Canada overall. Their differences are most noticeable in 2 key areas of the economy: the rise in living standards and what economists refer to as productivity performance over the long run. Productivity is important because it demonstrates how well a nation's citizens can transform ideas, labor, and raw materials into useful things. For a very long time, Australia has excelled in both of these fields. Meanwhile, wages have stagnated for decades in Canada and many other wealthy nations. In terms of productivity, Australia currently outperforms Canada by $4, meaning that for every hour worked, they generate more goods and services. Australia's per capita income growth has increased by 0.5 percentage point on average since 1990 relative to Canada. Furthermore, Australia has been outpacing Canada by 0.8 percentage points in terms of overall income growth. Even while they might not seem like much, over time, these discrepancies add up. For example, the average income per person in Australia is approximately $63,000. In Canada, it is approximately $58,000. Australia gained from broad economic reforms that were implemented between the early 1980s and the late 1990s. These reforms included deregulating the financial services and goods markets, privatizing state-owned companies, opening up the economy to foreign investment and trade, and introducing comprehensive competition laws. In other words, investment is the reason Australia's economy has outperformed Canada's. Australia has maintained a far greater level of investment as a percentage of its GDP, at least until quite recently. The development of novel ideas and technologies that propel productivity increases depends on investment spending. Americans are often wealthier than Canadians and Australians, but there was a time when Canadians and Australians were performing better than each other. Their economies flourished in the early 2000s as a result of increased commodity prices. Their GDP per person even momentarily eclipsed the US GDP per capita in terms of dollars at one point, somewhere in the early 2010s. However, their fortunes are strongly correlated with the long-term volatility of the demand for commodities. The country's strong reliance on gas and oil exports may present problems because of initiatives to cut carbon emissions. However, Australia might do better because of its abundant mineral reserves, particularly copper, which are essential for the switch to greener technologies. But Australia's reliance on selling commodities to China could hurt the country's economy. Remember to subscribe, leave a comment, and give this video a thumbs up if you loved it. We would love to hear your opinions. Until the next video, see ya.